Okay, it looks like it's a couple minutes past 4. Franco, shall we kick it off?
Yep, thanks, Corinne. Let's get started. So my name is Franco Montalto from Drexel University. I apologize, I have a little bit of a sore throat today. Welcome to the June 2020 edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. Those of you joining us for the first time, we do these seminars monthly. We've been doing them back to 2014. We usually have some combination of between 1 and 3 speakers, and then we have ample opportunities for discussion, Q&A, and if you're interested in joining any of the previous or seeing any of our previous editions going back to 2014, you can go to the CCRun website, ccrun.org, where all of our previous editions have been saved. For those of you seeking PDH credits, we do provide certificates of completion. You can email Corinne or myself, and you'll get some information from Corinne in a second about how to email with your name, and we will email you back a certificate of completion. On the topic of PDH hours, I also want to give a just raise your attention to this summer. CCRun through Drexel is offering a course on stormwater planning in the era of climate change. And we will be working with real cities to help them develop design storms for the future, considering changes in precipitation.
It looks like Franco might have frozen. To continue with his thoughts, so we're offering a summer course at Drexel called Stormwater Planning in the Era of Climate Change. Franco will be teaching this class. It starts June 24th. It's a 10-week course, and there are Drexel students enrolled in the course, and we're also allowing professional engineers to enroll to get 20 hours of professional development hour credit for $600. So if you are a professional engineer seeking credit and are interested in this course, if you go to that URL on the bottom, sorry, let me just share my screen real quick. Sorry about that. So if you go to this URL, tinyurl.com/summer stormwater course. There's more information about that course on that page, and that's also a survey form for you to apply to enroll in the course. So I hope you'll consider that. So our topic today is designing for climate change, contemporary approaches to decreasing emissions, increasing resilience, and community-led action. And Franco was going to read the bios, and I don't have them up right now, so I apologize. But I wonder if the speakers could give a quick introduction to themselves, if you don't mind. And then after that, I'm just going to talk through some controls about how to use the Zoom webinar, and then we'll get started. So let's start with Nick. Nick, sorry, you're muted.
Got it. Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Pevzner. I'm a senior lecturer in landscape architecture at the Stuart Weitzman School of Design at University of Pennsylvania. And I research the spatial impacts of the renewable energy transition and energy landscapes more broadly.
Thank you. And Shachi?
Hi everyone, I'm Shachi Pandey, and I am the founding principal of Metropolitan Urban Design Workshop, or MUD Workshop. This is a community-centric urban design and planning firm. And I am also an adjunct faculty at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation.
Hi everyone, I'm Jalisa Gilmore, the research analyst at the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and I coordinate our Waterfront Justice Project, which is a resiliency campaign for New York City's industrial waterfront.
Hi everybody, my name is Juan Camilo Osorio. I'm an assistant professor at the Graduate Center for Planning and the Environment at Pratt Institute. And I study the relationship between cities and environmental conflict, the extent to which urbanization creates inequality, and so forth. And in particular, I'm very interested in the political economy of climate change adaptation and its relationship to environmental justice and climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for introducing yourselves. Franco just texted me that he lost power and it hasn't come back on yet, so it might be a little while till he joins us again, but I'm sure he'll be back by the end of the panel. If y'all are in Philadelphia, we had some powerful thunderstorms roll through and I lost power myself earlier, so apologies for that. I'm gonna let Nick take the screen and kick us off. As you're setting that up, Nick, I just wanna mention for folks that want to participate either in the Q&A or if you have any comments that you'd like to send over. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, if you're using a computer, there's a chat window. So if there's any technical difficulties, if you are having trouble hearing or seeing anything, please use the chat window. And then later when we get to the moderated discussion that Juan Camilo is going to lead, if you could use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen instead of the chat window, that will help us organize the questions. And you're also able to raise your hand if you roll, it's usually on the right-hand side of your screen in the participant window. If you can raise your hand, then I'll be able to see that and can unmute you. But it's typically better if we try to stick with the Q&A. So if you have a question that you could type out, that would be ideal. Okay, so I'll kick it off to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. So I'll be talking about a little bit of the difference between climate mitigation and climate adaptation and how designers have been engaging with these two trends. Suffice it to say that we're in a climate emergency, and I don't think I need to go through all the ways in which climate change is predicted to manifest itself, which we should all be familiar with by now. But we are beginning to understand more and more how already vulnerable communities, minority communities, low-income communities, are projected to suffer disproportionate impacts from climate stressors. And so flooding in the US already disproportionately harms communities of color. And this is on top of the disproportionate health impacts that people of color have been experiencing with the coronavirus and the economic downturn and all kinds of systemic inequalities baked into the urban environment. For years now, green infrastructure has been a feature of landscape architecture, of urban design, of planning. This is usually discussed as kind of a more resilient and low-cost option than traditional gray infrastructure. However, there's a range of definitions of what people mean by this term. And so in the context of climate change, designers and planners have been pushing for example, the integration of living breakwaters, of smart seawalls, of wetland buffers, and other landscape strategies that can soften or replace the civil engineering menu of traditional flood control. And here you see some of the finalists of the Rebuild by Design competition in New York, sponsored by HUD. Design strategies employed green infrastructure here for a number of reasons: for flood control, for water management, for creating marine habitat. Some of these finalist projects also focused on reducing social vulnerability, on evacuation response, on reducing heat stress, etc. And so these kinds of design projects can broadly be grouped under the umbrella of strategies for climate adaptation. So in other words, reducing or managing the negative impacts of climate change that climate change will inevitably cause. Aside from flooding, this umbrella of climate adaptation can also include things like heat stress, fire management, especially with the wildfires we've seen out west, impacts to the food supply and to the economy, as well as other kinds of climate stressors. Aside from flooding, the umbrella of climate adaptation, also really incorporates heat stress as a major threat to populations. So heat waves are not a new phenomenon. certainly, but they've been getting worse with climate change, and cities have been looking for strategies to protect their residents. Back in 1995, urban sociologist Eric Kleinenberg, in his classic case study of the 1995 Chicago heat wave, found that communities that had weaker social ties ended up with higher mortality and were less able to weather the stresses that tend to kill the most vulnerable, the elderly. And so in his subsequent book, Palaces for the People, Kleinenberg advocates for social infrastructure and civic institutions that can start to strengthen communities' social networks and make populations less vulnerable to dangerous external stresses. And for him, these start to look a lot like the traditional public institutions of libraries. And so here's where design comes in. We might start thinking about what potentials start to open up if we reimagine what the umbrella is of what we consider infrastructure, to include social infrastructure, to include other kinds of services. And this is kind of a central consideration in some of the climate adaptation work today. On the other side of the spectrum of design responses to climate change are strategies for climate mitigation. So, in other words, the preventing or reducing of the actual extent of the climate change in the first place. And primarily this is by reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that lead to climate stress in the long term. And so there's a number of strategies that can be grouped under climate mitigation. But one major area where there has been some design work, but where more is needed, is on electricity and energy. Very often, it's these landscape impacts of energy infrastructure that result in local opposition, and this is opposition that we don't have time for in the renewable energy transition. And so there are some examples of designers engaging with this topic and trying to find better resolutions that can achieve better social buy-in. Many of these examples are from Europe, and here we see two precedents from the Netherlands by H+N+S landscape architects looking at spatial resolution of renewable energy landscapes and how they actually might hit the ground. Another big bucket is the reconsideration of urban form based on rethinking of transportation. And so this might mean electrification of the transportation fleet. It might mean rethinking the street section to improve the kind of the walkability, the bikeability, and the mass transit ability to move through the city equitably. Studios like WXY have done work kind of consulting and unpacking the spatial ramifications of this kind of switch, in this case for NYSERDA, looking at regional strategies for electric vehicles and electrification. Recently, I ran a studio as part of the urban design core at the University of Pennsylvania that took on the redesign of the historic boulevard system in Chicago, imagining alternative street sections and what they could do to catalyze the adjacent urban fabric. And so this is some work from one of the student teams looking at an area in the south side of Chicago and how measures like low emission zones, for example, might be implemented, but also might be done in such a way that they start to restitch some of the legacies of disinvestment in the south side and might start to kind of reintroduce civic facilities and new modes of transportation throughout the urban fabric. Of course, these are academic exercises, and so they didn't have the same kind of community participation that you'd want to see in an actual city-led initiative. But neighborhoods on the Chicago south and west sides have been vocal about these kinds of necessary improvements. And so we can look to examples of actual on-the-ground work from designers such as Interface Studio out of Philadelphia, where an actual participatory planning and design process leads to developing collective shared visions for the future of public space in particular neighborhoods. And this is the award-winning Wicker Park Bucktown Master Plan that they helped develop. third major bucket in climate mitigation is the one that deals with the building sector. So buildings account for over a quarter of global CO2 emissions if you just count the electricity that they use. But if you count also the carbon in their materials, buildings start to account for over 40% of all emissions. And so the World Green Building Council defines net zero buildings as those that generate 100% of their energy needs on site or offset the remainder from carbon-free energy sources. And so for the last 20 years, this has been the focus of many architects, reducing the operational energy demand in buildings. But now it's clear that it's not just the operational energy that we need to be worried about. There's also this kind of large bucket of emissions in the embodied carbon in the manufacturing transportation of those building materials and all the way down through the supply chain. So this is their concrete, their steel, their aluminum, their glass. And increasingly, architects and engineers are able to use tools like life cycle assessment calculators that can track the emissions associated with materials, with construction, with end of life, but also start thinking more creatively about how buildings might begin to be potential carbon sinks in the built environment with carbon sequestering materials like negative carbon concrete or sustainably grown mass timber, for example. And so Dave Roberts, the climate and energy reporter for Vox, has summarized the major thrust of regulating these kinds of emissions under this big kind of bucket of electricity, cars, buildings. And altogether, electricity, cars, and buildings account for nearly 2/3 of US emissions. And these sectors have found their way into Jay Inslee's climate plan when he ran for president, into Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders' plans as well. But how does this work of climate mitigation begin to affect communities on the ground? There's, of course, the jobs associated with decarbonization. We typically think of work like this as green jobs, but are they good green jobs? There are studies that show that residential solar install is less unionized and lower paid than utility scale solar installers, for example, and that there are barriers for people of color to access these job opportunities. Even before they became codified as the three legs of the Green New Deal vision, these three legs of climate, jobs, and justice were becoming the new tenets of environmental justice organizations and the environmental left. And so this idea that rapid decarbonization can create trillions of dollars in clean energy investment, in clean energy jobs, and that they ought to go as much as possible to historically disinvested, vulnerable, and frontline communities. That's the justice piece. This has been kind of beginning to be baked into the ideas about a just transition. With the recent Green New Deal framing that has emerged, it does bring up interesting historical reminders about the diversity of jobs that we can think about, in addition to the kind of solarization and sustainable construction sector. And these might include the original New Deal's focus on employment in forestry or in afforestation work, in fire management. And so if we think of the original New Deal expanded suite of strategies as kind of a menu for how we can start thinking about climate mitigation more broadly, we might start to think about another category besides electricity, cars, and buildings. And we can think of this maybe as a sector that we can refer to as climate smart landscapes. So this can include projects to do ecological restoration on sites in order to add tree cover or remediate old mining sites. It can entail smarter fire management and land management that can lock up the forest carbon and prevent it from going back up into the atmosphere as environments get hotter, drier, and burn more frequently. It can work with a whole range of agricultural techniques that reduce the amount of emissions from agriculture and lock up soil carbon. Collectively, this is being considered under the umbrella of regenerative agriculture. And it can also mean lavishing more attention on urban sites, including brownfields and vacant land, planting urban forests that can act as carbon sinks, provide nearby nature in cities, kind of bring nature closer to where people live, while also fighting urban heat island and climate-induced heat stresses at the same time. And so in general, these ideas are not new, but we need more strategies for carbon smart landscapes. Maybe just one example from some of my recent teaching. What might it look like to incorporate community concerns and design for community power with community input? So in a recent landscape and planning studio at UPenn focused on Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, some of my students took on the climate adaptation ideas of strengthened social infrastructure and resilient emergency services, and the climate mitigation idea of local renewable energy in order to propose designs for a series of community centers that might become multi-purpose community hubs and emergency resilience hubs. And in this students project, Way is looking at the neighborhood of Playita next to the San Jose Lagoon in San Juan, which has been traditionally overlooked by the city, whose residents are particularly acutely vulnerable to flooding, and indeed did flood very heavily in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And so his project takes advantage of an existing publicly owned parcel and starts thinking about both infrastructure and public space as something that can work together on the same site at the same time. Typically, infrastructure and public space are thought of as two separate things, and infrastructure is invisible to most people until it starts to break down. But in this case, by highlighting the civic and public role of infrastructure in the community, it begins to acquire a more foregrounded presence. So in this case, there's a proposed learning center, community gym, and library next to a central plaza and local market. But at the same time, there's a proposed integration of infrastructure like recycling and local power from anaerobic digestion and solar, along with emergency supply storage, water filtration, water storage tanks, ice production, and a cooling center, all of them visible to the community and all of them addressing some of these critical services that broke down in the blackout following the hurricane. And so across the studio, when we imagined what local strong nodes in the energy network might look like, many students argued that they should be these kinds of multifunctional facilities reinforced through public space with housing, with higher density, and then of course also have all of the emergency response components like shelter, staging, evacuation, and critical reliable food and water supply, medicine, cooling, etc. So speculative projects like this perhaps offer a glimpse of what a community-centered approach to resilience might look like. In reality, of course, such projects must be informed by the experiences, needs, and expectations and imaginations of communities that actually live in these locations. And the studio projects that were emerging from this work were picking up on some of that work that had already been pioneered by local community groups and organizations. Community organizations like Resilient Power Puerto Rico, Marvell Architects, and Casa Pueblo, which were already building community facilities that created places in their neighborhood that were anti-colonial and emancipatory because they built community autonomy and self-sufficiency and local skills and knowledge. And they did this not just during the emergency response, but also during the fair weather days as a way of building social infrastructure and community cohesion. So I guess this has been my high-level theoretical overview without delving into the particulars of how projects are actually implemented. And now I'll turn it over to Shachi, who will take us into some of the nitty-gritty of how some of these projects might actually come to pass.
Thank you, Nick. Just give me a second here as I share my screen. So thanks, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to focus today on some design and planning tactics that we as urban designers, planners, landscape architects, and architects have been using to plan for resiliency. and even before resiliency became a buzzword in 2012. I want to highlight some of the challenges in realizing these projects where there might be an opportunity for improvement. I'll take a deeper dive into one project, and in the interest of time, just skim through the others, but it will be apparent that each of them share some commonalities in terms of their intents and the opportunities they present for rethinking how to realize large-scale and long-term projects. Sherman Creek Waterfront Esplanade was a project commissioned by the EDC. It's a project I did prior to founding Mud Workshop. And it is located along the Harlem River in the northernmost section of Manhattan. The project establishes a concept design and planning framework for an open space amenity to revitalize this section of the Harlem River waterfront, which actually has been inaccessible to the public for decades. When completed, it would become a part of the Manhattan Greenway, which is a 32.5-mile greenway loop, as you can see right here, that will connect a network of green spaces totaling more than almost 1,000 acres and larger than Central Park along the borough's waterfront. This site is set in a very, very heavy industrial context. Here you can see the MTA yards, the Con Edison substations and power plants, and Department of Transportation facilities, and just swaths and swaths of just surface parking around the site. Historically, the site was characterized by mudflats and tidal wetlands, and some of these are even here today. This area in this picture that you see here is the Sherman Creek Inlet, where mudflats are still exist, and it was once a salt marsh and a natural habitat for native flora and fauna. It played an important role in the ecology of the region, and we found that the community was very interested in restoring the natural habitat at this location. But over the years and with industrialization, the area has just transformed into a place that has very heavy infrastructure and that cut the waterfront access from upland residential neighborhoods. Most of these facilities, because of the nature of what they are fenced off for safety. And in some cases, they're also walled off, both on the water's edge as well as along the streets. So it really does not make a very pleasant place for the general public. In fact, with the truck traffic on 10th Avenue, it can actually be a hazard if one is not careful. Another community goal was to have continuous access along the waterfront. And as you can see here, that there was a challenge of multiple ownerships. The black part is the part that you see is publicly owned. And then there's other parts that are not publicly owned. There are private properties where naturally public access is restricted. In addition, even publicly owned properties have operations that go all the way to the edge of the shoreline. And that leaves very, very little room for being able to carve out an esplanade. We responded to these issues by establishing 4 principles for our design concept. The first was addressing pollution and climate through green design. And we did that by restoring historic wetlands and thereby the water quality. The second was coexistence, which was very important because we wanted to ensure that any new civic space can coexist with the current industrial and heavy commercial uses in the area. Third, community-centric programming, which included opportunities to get down to the water, and it was also a key desire that the community wanted, gave rise to another principle for our project. And lastly, but not least, the community really wanted to have continuous and unimpeded public waterfront access, which then became central to our project. So here is an image of the salt marsh that was proposed in the original location that I showed in the photograph earlier, where there was a mud flat. It was done by cutting back on a public street that was not being used. And adjacent to the salt marsh is also a freshwater wetland that would capture runoff from the industrial areas. So these wetlands together not only provided habitats for biodiversity, but they acted as systems to extract waste and clean the water that flows through them. They also mitigate climate change by sequestering and storing large quantities of blue carbon in the vegetation and sediments below. Blue carbon marine systems, in fact, store almost 10 times more than if the same area on a land-based forest were to store carbon, so they're really, really effective. We also introduced a walkway over the wetland that would give expansive views and allow visitors to experience the wetland system and the habitats. The northern edge of the site that we see here, because of its location and how set back it is from the navigation channel, provided a protected place to launch boats. This was very popular with the community because boating was a popular sport on the Harlem River and the community wanted to have it back. So we proposed a boat launch at this location and a salt marsh in the Cove area. For the parts that were limited in space, we proposed a walkway over the water to maintain continuity, and any overwater shading was minimized by using a meshed surface. Meshed metal surface that would allow sunlight to penetrate into the river. And also just below these meshed surface and along the water's edge here, we have restored the natural riprap edge of the shoreline here, which allowed for mussel farming. In addition, this green screen system that we used this to replace waterfront fences as well as street fences wherever possible to protect the public from adjacent industrial uses. The next project that I want to discuss is the Sunset Park Vision Plan, another long-range planning and design project that is located along Brooklyn's waterfront. Sunset Park is a significant maritime and industrial area, and its development, which started in the earlier decades of 1900, was based on a platform of manufacturing and distribution of goods. It was well suited at that time and for the infrastructure and building types that developed. For example, the Brooklyn Army Terminal played a key role during World War II. But in the late 1900s, as the nature of industry changed altogether, there was a lot of disinvestment that reduced its ability to remain competitive as an industrial and as a working waterfront. So the main challenge here was to figure out ways to adapt and reuse antiquated infrastructure and develop it into a diverse, dense, and environmentally sustainable industry. So the vision plan outlined strategies for a modern industrial waterfront with a combination of improved freight transportation systems, buildings that could accommodate a range of sizes of industries and policies that would promote environmentally friendly and efficient practices. Today, both the Brooklyn Army Terminal and the Industry City host a range of industrial activities and startup businesses. And the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal district has a large recycling facility, the Sims Recycling. In addition to the industrial improvements, the plan proposed, this actually was a subsequent project that we did after the vision plan, which proposed balancing neighborhood needs by creating safer environments and resources for workers and adjacent area residents. So the Bush Terminal Park and Safe Upland Connections were some of the concrete proposals that helped achieve that balance. I wanted to share the next two examples of comprehensive planning to showcase how it can be possible within the existing policy structures to introduce sustainable ideas, projects, and practices. When we did the City of Easton Comprehensive Plan, we realized that the topography of the city and comprehensive plans, before I dive into that, comprehensive plans in general are long-range policy plans, and they're more policy focused than they are physical design focused. So we wanted to still look at the plan and provide some concrete physical recommendations and projects that the city could use and work on immediately to improve resiliency citywide. So when we did this, we realized that the topography of the city divided its neighborhoods, but it also presented a real opportunity to develop a citywide framework to capture and treat stormwater. So we studied all scales of streets and introduced a set of possibilities, or you might say toolkits, that could be adopted by different streets given how much space was available or how the existing infrastructure in the streets was currently laid out. Not only did that manage runoff, but it also allowed for more seamless transition between neighborhoods, and by providing, it did that by providing a more continuous and connected identity between neighborhoods. In Hoboken, through outreach and community-centric planning workshops, we introduced the idea of integrated networks, where people would start to see the connection between blue-green mobility and resiliency networks and how these could translate into the built environment and sustainable practices. I'd like to end with an academic project by my students done this last fall at Columbia's GSAPP. But before I do that, what I wanted to do was sum up some key issues that were common theme in all of the projects that I just presented. And these continue to impact in one way or another any capital or long range planning project. The first is the idea of contested spaces. As we saw, almost all spaces in dense urban areas are occupied by multiple uses. These may or may not be compatible with each other, but they're vital to the diversity that makes the many layers of urban areas so resilient. So we have to continually strive to seek how these uses can all coexist. And that one doesn't win over sort of the other because they're all vital. The second is the issue of multiple land ownership. And this pattern, it becomes even more pronounced as project sizes increase in urban areas. And to be able to, so it becomes really difficult to be able to do any project, especially a project that doesn't have direct, that may or may not have direct revenue benefits for private owners. What I wanted to say that it is important to continue to keep working with stakeholders and communities and that's the only way to ensure sort of the long-term success of projects. There's always limited capital and limited time, but I won't elaborate on that too much. I will say that we have to find a way to fund public and green projects through public dollars as much as possible, and use the tactic of increasing density through rezoning and thereby, displacing populations. I think we need to start to look at more creative ways in addition to just this tactic in urban areas. And lastly, I also feel that although there is participation at the community level, there is yet to be real control at every stage of the project for the community to have a say. And it needs to become a lot more easier for the community to do that. So keeping in mind these challenges, that I just described, I want to talk about this project by my students. Here, what they're doing is they're proposing a new framework for selecting projects that get funded publicly. Because it is not always possible to achieve a net zero carbon outcome in projects, of smaller scale or any scale that is isolated. So if you look at this in the context of a region and all of the projects within it, it becomes a little bit easier. Through this framework, what the students did was they developed opportunities for partnerships and collaborations that would otherwise not be expected. For example, an urban area project in partnership with a farm project would be able to achieve a net zero outcome when they were conceived of together or in tandem. In addition, projects would be scored on the social vulnerabilities. So these, and on carbon benefit, of course. But if you look at social vulnerabilities, these could include metrics like socioeconomic status, minority status, access to housing, transportation, etc. As an example, if we look at this, these projects, these three projects here at different scales, the farm, urban, and a more top-down project, a household climate adaptation project could include a solar panels and bike lanes, and a farm project could include restorative, could use farmland transformation or regenerative agriculture. And both of these would score much higher than the data station on both accounts, the social vulnerability account as well as the carbon benefit account. So it would be important then for these larger projects to work along with the community projects. And what it would do is, what this framework essentially does is that it stresses a lot more on active community participation and also makes them a lot more competitive when applying for direct funding for public dollars. So I just wanted to leave you guys with food for thought of imagining a new framework of how do we fund more green projects in our communities. And with that, I will pass it on to Jalisa.
Thank you, Shachi. Let me just share my screen. So hi, everyone. I'm Jalisa Gilmore from the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, or NEJA, and I'll be discussing some of our research and advocacy in New York City's waterfront communities. And NEJA is a citywide coalition of grassroots organizations from New York City's most environmentally overburdened communities, areas that have dealt with the disproportionate siting of noxious facilities, including waste transfer stations, power plants, highways, as well as the lack of environmental amenities like green space. NEJA was founded in 1991 by community-based organizations from low-income communities of color, and we work to advocate for more equitable policy at the city and state level. And as the climate is changing and frontline communities are hit the hardest by the negative impacts, NEJA works on a number of different climate justice initiatives to address those impacts. So climate change through sea level rise, flooding, storm surge are increasingly threatening New York City's coastlines. And NEJA's Waterfront Justice Project was created to address these climate change impacts in the industrial waterfront. So New York City has these zones called Significant Maritime and Industrial Areas, or SMIAs, and they're designed to encourage a clustering of heavy industry and other polluting infrastructure like power plants, oil storage facilities, chemically intense businesses along the waterfront. And that's what that map of is on the left. And 7 of these zones in New York City are not just in environmental justice communities, but they're also in hurricane storm surge zones. So NEJA began to ask questions: what happens if a storm comes and floods these facilities, releasing chemicals into the community? What impacts would these already environmentally overburdened communities face, especially with climate change causing more frequent and intense storms? And this was before Hurricane Irene, before Superstorm Sandy, and none of the environmental regulations that existed addressed climate change. They talked about toxic exposure, but not climate change. And so that's how our Waterfront Justice Project came to be, a research and advocacy campaign that addresses climate change impacts in New York City's industrial waterfront. And we do this work by carrying out mapping and spatial analysis to understand the vulnerability of different facilities to climate change, as well as incorporating socioeconomic data to understand exactly who is vulnerable to some of these issues we're bringing up. And as with all of NEJA's work, the work is led by the community. We're a member-based organization. So we use a community-based participatory research model with the goal being to ensure that research arises from the community's needs and that these results are responsive to and inform community action. And all this is really ultimately, or part of it is to ensure that New York City is addressing the potential vulnerability of residents and workers from the risk associated with storing hazardous material during extreme weather events, and then also developing design guidelines for coastal development with this in mind. So I'm going to discuss the work in two environmental justice communities where NEJA has members, Hunts Point in the South Bronx and Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And both of these projects were focusing on small local businesses to build resilience. And this graphic on the right is a way to visualize the issue or the solution. So coastal flooding made worse by climate change can flood these businesses, washing chemicals into the community. There are different ways we can prevent this: green infrastructure, building protections, securing chemical storage. And NEJA would like to see the use of green infrastructure to control flooding in these areas, especially with the multiple co-benefits like reducing the urban heat island effect and improving air quality. But the focus on these two projects are securing chemical storage, and it's something that businesses can do while we continue to advocate for more green infrastructure in environmental justice communities. So the New York City industrial waterfront communities, pollution prevention, toxics reduction, and resiliency planning was a project that was focused on improving sustainability and climate resiliency in the South Bronx SMIA, specifically Hunts Point. And so NEJA partnered with the New York State DEC and the Pollution Prevention Institute, but more importantly with the local community organization, the Point CDC, who was part of NEJA. And they were really the ones who were working with the community and started the community stakeholder group, and it's grounded in the work that they were already doing. And so this project assessed 60 local businesses, and these were auto shops, food manufacturing and processing facilities, as well as dry cleaners and remediation sites. And this was in order to identify and implement cost-effective strategies to adapt to a changing climate, while also preventing pollution and reducing potential toxic exposures. And ultimately, the project provided on-site technical assistance to two businesses to put these practices into place. And so the project team also created a toolkit with inventory of practices of what these businesses can do to prevent chemicals from being released into the environment. And the toolkit focused on automotive services sector with specific recommendations for how they can help create a healthier work environment, as well as preventing chemicals from being released in the event of flooding. There was also a community workshop to further share this information with other businesses besides for the ones that had the on-site technical assistance, and just bring awareness to the community in general about these issues. And this work in toolkit is important because businesses need support to adapt to climate change, and they need technical and financial resources to implement them. And we use this toolkit as an example to identify clear strategies that businesses can take on and to advocate for them to get this support. And so this research in Sunset Park, Brooklyn builds off of the South Bronx work but we really wanted to dive deeper into the actual health impacts of potential exposures for the people living in the community, working in the community. So the Grassroots Research to Action in Sunset Park is a collaboration between NEJA, our member organization UPROSE, the RAND Corporation, and Lifeline Group. And this was really to support those community-based actions looking to reduce contamination associated with industrial waterfronts. And the current work we're doing is part of a multi-year research project to really understand the public health risks of auto shop products that may be released into the environment during a storm surge event. But the project is really much more than that. We're trying to understand the business's perception to the risk of climate change, trying to understand what products are being used in the shop and how they're stored, as well as modeling how different storm scenarios can affect these chemicals being dispersed into the community, and understanding the health risks and how certain practices can reduce this. And all this is done through a community-based participatory research framework, which has been important to ground truth assumptions that we're making and working with the businesses and communities to really understand their needs. And ultimately, GRASP will develop resources to help these auto shops in Sunset Park implement these chemical security practices to reduce the threat of chemicals being released, and protecting the community and ensuring businesses are resilient to a changing climate. We really hope that once this research is complete, we can use these lessons learned to benefit other industrial waterfronts, because throughout the US, we put our industry along the waterfront. And so then I just also wanted to go back to the South Bronx and in Hunts Point in the South Bronx to talk a little bit more about coastal resiliency in Hunts Point. And so following the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, the Rebuild by Design competition was launched to award federal funding for resilience building projects. The Hunts Point's residents eagerly engaged and produced the Hunts Point Lifeline proposal, which included integrated flood protection, community resilience, and just much more, and ultimately received a total of $45 million from federal and city funds for the Hunts Point resiliency. And so after a long community engagement process, 2 priority categories were identified for further research, further funding. And this was a flood risk reduction and resilient energy. And so the Hunts Point resiliency resulted in a pilot project to increase the resiliency of the Hunts Point Food Distribution Center through a local tri-generation microgrid, as well as rooftop solar and storage on 2 public schools. And that was really great. And then there was a final feasibility study for flood risk, resulting in hardening of critical infrastructure. And so although Hunts Point resiliency didn't result in that integrated flood protection and green infrastructure that the community originally wanted, the Point CDC and NEJA, we still continue to advocate for green infrastructure as a coastal protection strategy in Hunts Point. And so just really to talk about how NEJA kind of works towards climate resiliency through research and advocacy and the projects that I just mentioned, the key approaches really are that, this partnership involves multiple stakeholders. So it's the advocates, the scientists, and the planners. Let's just make sure that everyone who, needs to be involved is involved. And then as well as climate change strategies that support business. Industrial facilities are a source of potential public health hazard, but they're also a source of economic opportunity. So we don't want to just zone away industry, but really work with them to build more resilient communities. And then the last one is just really community-led research and advocacy. Any research or advocacy really has to be nested in a community-led campaign. is it really make sure that we're accounting for local dynamics and that the results serve the local community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jalisa and Shachi and Nick. So we're going to pass it off to Juan Camilo to moderate a panel discussion between all of our panelists today. While we're setting that up, if you all wouldn't mind sending in some questions into the Q&A chat box. Juan Camilo has some questions for the panelists, and then we'll get on to audience questions. So use the little Q&A function on your screens to send us some questions. Thanks. Go ahead, Juan Camilo.
Thanks so much to the panelists. These were just fascinating presentations. I also want to start out by thanking the Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast and Drexel University for the invitation, and very especially to Corinne for bringing us together, organizing such an exciting event. It's really an honor to facilitate this conversation. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm very interested in the political economy of climate change action. Who gains, who benefits from this, and what are the unintended consequences of adaptation and mitigation strategies? Oftentimes, they're really well intended, but we just simply can't control some of the differential impacts that they have for different folks on the ground. So I wanted to start the discussion with this diagram by the Climate Justice Alliance and the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project that really challenges us to think, to understand the nature and implications to move from an extractive economy on the left toward a regenerative framework on the right hand of the screen. If you look at the center, this calls to reframe from an approach that is so much based on exploitation of labor in exchange for more cooperation. If you look at the left bubble, you'll see how this is asking to move from an almost exclusive extraction of natural resources to regeneration of raw materials. At the bottom, you see a system of governance that is traditionally top-down toward changing for a more bottom-up approach. On the right side of each of the diagrams, you see like the change from an exclusive pursuit of accumulation of wealth and power to the redistribution of ecological and social resources toward collective well-being. And all of this under a worldview that is based on consumerism and colonial mindsets, which you see on the left side of the screen, that require transformation to caring and wellness with large implications related with how we produce, consume, and how we waste or what we waste, right? So perhaps this is the perfect segue to the first question that I want to suggest for the panel. I think that all of you guys have touched some way or the other on this. But right now, communities are just beginning to stabilize in the light of the pandemic. And the summer is here for the Northern Hemisphere. And many people are asking, okay, so what are the key priorities in terms of climate change? So I want to ask if you guys, if we can go around and expand a little bit to answer the question of where do you see the biggest challenges and opportunities to protect large cities like Philadelphia or New York, Boston, etc., from the climate change impacts that are expected this year. Okay, so why don't we start with Nick? You go first.
Sure. Thank you, Juan Camilo, and thanks for posing such a powerful juxtaposition of the kind of existing power system versus potential alternative. So, I mean, I think every city has different climate threats, and for each one of them, the coronavirus pandemic is going to make each one more complicated. So for example, how would you evacuate people from flooding or offer cooling centers during a heat wave when you have to continue to socially distance? And so I think in the short term, designers can offer some quick suggestions and ideas, for safe staging, for temporary shelter, for making streets and shaded public spaces more functional while maintaining social distance. But I think first of all, not every community can afford their own, designer consultant. And so this must be something that the city engages and provides in an equitable and just manner. But then longer term, I think it raises questions about, how do you start to build this kind of regenerative economy when faced with a kind of a ramp up of climate stress? And so I think that's where moving away from really expensive and really difficult to maintain infrastructure towards a kind of a localization of power and empowerment might be a more sustainable option. And designers, I think, need to begin to get practice with how one starts to build that local power.
Thank you, Nick. So on the topic of designers, Shachi, what do you think?
Very interesting question, Juan. And one of the things that we're starting to do, and it just occurred to me, that we're going to be beginning a project in the town of Mamaroneck, hopefully, all things, slated to open up soon, hopefully. We were supposed to be beginning the project sometime in March, and, there was going to be the whole slew of sort of community outreach events that we had planned. And we were going to look at each topic that we look at in any given comprehensive plan, which is, parks and open spaces and transportation and networks. But, we had this idea that this is a great opportunity to, even before we launch the project, is to go to the community and talk to them about, hey, what do you think is the role of streets in your community now that you have been locked up for almost 2 months? How would you imagine these 120 feet wide roadways? And how do you think that they connect better with, your open space or green system? Because we also need to understand that municipalities that like Mamaroneck or other, municipalities that aren't as dense as New York City have very different challenges, right? And the communities there aren't always as integrated as they might be in New York City. So that's one of the approaches that we're taking, is that we're stepping back completely and opening up the whole community participation process and re-looking at all the infrastructure in the town and asking the community how they used it during this process and how they foresee using it in the future, so that we're not tied to the same, process of planning for infrastructure in our municipalities. And the other thing that I found really interesting in New York City was that because we all know that we have really small apartments and places, we've been dying to be out and our public places, and it was dangerous to even go out in public places. I think that just the kind of small scale design interventions that cropped up over the last month to make parks, social distancing, and parks and public places a lot more safe and still usable with the communities, I think that was just really, really great. I would recommend for those of you who are on the chat to actually look at Design for 6 Feet hashtag or account on Instagram. They've been posting design tactics from around the world, which are kind of a lot of fun, but also help keeping, sort of the economy and the community going. And they've included things like, just simple markings on parks to tactics to how to open up restaurants and use sidewalks as an extension of smaller restaurants and how they can be made safer. So I think it's been really, really interesting in the last 2 months to see how design has, at a very immediate scale, start to address the issue of social distancing, and yet, keep communities and economies going.
Thank you, Shachi. Jalisa, what is your take?
Yeah, so this COVID-19 pandemic, similar to climate change, just has had a disproportionate effect on, communities of color, low-income communities. And so I think one of the priorities definitely in Nietzsche's mind right now, I think Nick mentioned it, is extreme heat. The summer is coming and climate change heat waves are going to be more frequent. But we're supposed to still be social distancing, and cooling centers are a key strategy for New York City to, help people get some relief from heat. But if they're in their homes without air conditioners, how is that possible? Recently, the mayor and the city have been taking some steps to address this, and with the purchase of air conditioners and using schools as cooling centers to account for more space. But there's still the underlying issues of extreme heat, what happens next summer? Are these same practices still going to be happening? And there's still just some extreme heat points that need to be addressed. Cooling centers still, the locations aren't announced before an actual heat emergency. And now if you're going to be adding additional cooling centers and changing locations, people need to know ahead of time so they can prepare properly for it. There's just, we need to continue to address all of the extreme heat issues and fund long-term community preparedness, like the Be a Buddy program for community-based organizations so that they can really be prepared. And then also another priority is, as we're going back online, you talked about, extractive economies, and we can't continue to, have extractive economies. We need to move towards a regenerative economies. And there's a lot of climate solutions that can really get us out of some of this economic devastation that the pandemic has brought about. So these climate solutions really can help the environment, but help people as well, because that's the ultimate goal.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for highlighting that. Back to Nick. And by the way, thanks so much for folks that have been putting your questions. Make sure that you put them in the Q&A. That helps us. We're going to go over a couple of questions that I've prepared for the panelists, and then we'll open up and begin to engage with some of your own questions. So thanks so much for that. Nick, as we begin to understand the prospect of what an adaptation economy could look like, right? The process that you were talking about, through which communities, employers, workers begin to work together to anticipate the types of goods and services required for full adaptation to climate change. Where do you see the role of planners and designers in affecting local economic development? In other words, what are the key questions that planners and designers, environmentalists, placemakers should be asking themselves now to continue to refine our understanding of what green jobs are, and what should they entail, right? What does this have to do with equity and justice?
Yeah, thanks, Juan Camilo. So, I mean, I think some of this falls naturally in the designer's purview, and some of it does not. So I think designers are spatial thinkers, planners are spatial thinkers. And so from a spatial point of view, there's a real need for designers to help to communicate and visualize and understand what some of these threats are and where exactly they will affect, right? So the threat of flooding, especially sea level rise with all of the climate uncertainties, is a really complex thing to communicate. And so working with communities and cities to convey what are the spaces and places that will be affected is a really important task. Within that, there's the work of starting to think about how do we adapt the urban fabric. Does it mean building by building retrofits? Does it mean selectively saving and elevating and changing important historic and cultural facilities? Maybe further down the road, it means kind of a selective unbuilding of the coast, but on the community's own terms, not something that's imposed and kind of very sudden and without any chance to kind of make any kind of input or work on that process. So I think those things are all spatial and really important. Where designers typically don't do so well is in understanding the power dynamics and maybe questioning those prevailing economic and political drivers. And so there, I think we have to be mindful as designers of enabling disaster capitalism and climate gentrification. And this has come up in the questions and in Jalisa's talk as well. The fact that more and more speculators will see high ground as more valuable. And just like any kind of neighborhood change where communities, if not enabled and empowered to push back, kind of get steamrolled. And so how do you, either through kind of some kind of preemptive, cooperative or collective ownership, land trusts, some kind of tax strategy, empower communities to hold on to land that otherwise they would be priced out of over time.
Thank you. You mentioned speculation, and that's a perfect segue to the next question. In fact, very much in sync with a question that we got in the Q&A from Jeannie. Shachi, so your case studies illustrate the importance to think about the waterfront with a comprehensive approach, right, that improves environmental and ecological conditions while building community resilience. That comes clear in terms of the different examples that you showed. In the Sherman Creek case study, for example, the community has been planning for adaptation measures for almost 2 decades, but has not been able to secure the financial resources required for implementation, right? So how can communities afford expensive improvements without displacing the current residents, right? And from your point of view, what would be some recommendations for some of the professionals or the different disciplines that are joining us today in terms of how can they respond to climate adaptation without green or climate gentrification?
I think one of the reasons, and this comes up so many times when we do community engagement and workshops, that people are often reserved in improving their communities because they feel that, oh, this is going to lead to gentrification. And I think the reason for that, basically, I think that the word gentrification is kind of a bad word, quote unquote bad word, because of the pace at which projects change the landscape of the area. That doesn't keep up with the pace at which generations and communities evolve over time. What happens is that the pace at which development and transition happens, and that all of the sort of public benefits are tied to these developments, then that, and it happens at a fast pace that it just ends up displacing people who within maybe a span of 5 to 10 years, have not been able to get to a point where they can afford to be in those places anymore. It's like better for them to kind of move out. So there's 2 things. One is, something that Nick alluded to, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But the one thing that we as designers, capital agencies, and communities need to really get good at is to effectively identify and act on the so-called low-hanging fruits. There's always an element of the project that can happen now, that needs to happen now, and that maybe isn't as capital intensive, but that can begin and still, provide the much needed revitalization that communities need, rather than wait for, the more capital intensive projects. I know we talk about it a lot, but I don't know if we are as effective in actually identifying them and executing them, be it in terms of permitting, or, that's always a big challenge. Or there is always a challenge of getting, organized in order to even put together an application of what you want to do. So my thought is that at the community level, when as architects, urban designers, and planners, we should definitely think about in early engagement, empowering and educating community organizations to be able to effectively identify and start off on projects early, rather than wait on long-range design projects and wait for, maybe a rezoning to happen and for it to, and then see how it evolves. Because once, this is a great political strategy. I think that once a community kind of gets established, in a place, it's hard to, remove that over the long term. And it is more effective if a developer comes in and plans something than a developer to read a planning report and say, oh, this is what I have to do and act on. No, it's right here live in front of you and it's happening. So the developer or any other private investment is bound to act according to that. The other thing that Nick alluded to, which I find very interesting, is this sort of land banking and land ownership. And I brought it up briefly in one of my students' projects. I think that it's a very different framework of thinking, a framework of thinking where you are empowering small scale investments by individuals in a community by introducing this idea of carbon benefits as well as social vulnerabilities. And if these become the parameters of measuring how successful a project is, whether it's privately funded or publicly funded, if these become more sort of mainstream in how we evaluate projects, both at the local level and also at the federal level, I think that that would bring about a big change, and it would empower individuals to then apply for and also, be able to do their own community projects. So at both these scales, at the policy scale as well as at the community organization scale, I think there is opportunity to advance projects now and to advance them in a more responsible way without responsible and thoughtful way without attracting gentrification in a short span of time.
Thanks so much to both of you, actually. I think that you've been really clear in terms of delineating what an ethical, progressive professional practice could look like in maintaining a connection between what the vision is and who ultimately should benefit from it. Sometimes that's tricky and it doesn't happen. There are horror stories where actually these things do not work out. Back to you, Jalisa, from your point of view, and as the main representative of grassroots advocacy in this panel, I'm wondering if you can please expand a little bit on what are the key conditions that enable successful partnerships between local communities and academics, governments, the private sector. What are the type of recommendations that you make to make sure that not only folks that are well-intended and ready to engage in the way that we've heard from our two colleagues can actually result in meaningful engagement and a powerful response and recognition of local leadership as well?
Yeah, so I think I touched on it a little bit in my presentation, but partnerships definitely are important to being able to get work done. You need different expertise, from all of the different sectors in the community for stuff to actually get through. But you can't forget about the community perspective, because those are the ones who are living there, working there, and who ultimately it's benefiting. But so with that, how to be a good partner, the communities are doing a lot of work already, and they know what their community needs and they know the issues in their communities. So really making sure that you're not just going into a community with a project, but you're trying to work with the community to figure out how you can make a current project already better. And it kind of goes to Shachi's point about saying if communities start the project and someone comes in, it's already there. But you know, there are projects and working with the community that's already there and trying to understand what their priorities are and what their needs are, and recognizing that you can learn a lot from the community. There's all different types of people in the community, and there's experts there as well. And then if you're going to have a community engagement process, it should be more than that. It should be a community partner. And if you're going to do community engagement, you can't do it halfway. You know, you have to make sure that community is involved from beginning to the end. You can't just go in there, you know, do one meeting and like hear from the community and like hear what they have to say, and then go back into another space and like make all the decisions and then say, hey, this is what we're doing, and there's no further discussion. That's not going to work, and it's going to, you know, kind of erode any trust that the community has with you, and, you know, for future projects that really can make improvements to, you know, fighting climate change.
So Jalisa, tell us something. From your point of view, what are the lessons to be learned in New York and the region from Superstorm Sandy recovery and rebuilding in this regard?
Yeah, so it's 8 years after Superstorm Sandy, and there's still a lot of coastal investments that haven't been made, and, you know, communities are still waiting for this, and the city has kind of continued to prioritize the financial district in Lower Manhattan, where places like Hunts Point, East Harlem, North Brooklyn, environmental justice communities, Sunset Park, they still need these investments now to make sure that they're resilient towards, you know, any climate change impacts on the coast. And so what NEJA really would like to see is, you know, the city prioritizing these areas for coastal investments like green infrastructure, nature-based solutions. And this is what we need to protect our community, and just making sure that, again, any engagement process that the city has, like Hunts Point Resiliency or East Side Coastal Resiliency, you know, at the end of the process, the community isn't feeling like we didn't get what we needed, even though we made it very clear what we needed for, you know, to make our communities more resilient to a changing climate.
Thank you. Shachi, Nick, would you like to add anything to lessons from Sandy?
I mean, I think Jalisa's point about building trust is super critical, and it's a slow process. I think there's probably a lot of designers who engaged with that very unwieldy and very political rebuild by design process that you know, will be able to reflect from their personal experience. I cannot, but I think what we've seen is that it's very easy for design to get pushed out at the very end, and for the development piece to move forward. And so it makes us question, you know, what role do designers actually have if those things can be disentangled and can be used to maybe make more palatable something that shouldn't be.
Shachi, do you want to add something to this question?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with Nick, especially in the context of rebuild by design competitions, or with, you know, what Jalisa has pointed out. I really think that not only designers, but also all of the hard work that communities do in coming out there to plan, to design, and to work with us to develop ideas, and then you know, to see it, that is to see it, you know, then really get sidetracked is a little bit disappointing. And that's what I meant when I brought out, you know, one of the challenges was that while there is a process that is established for community engagement, I think we still have a really, really long way in terms of actually creating a framework where the community actually has control. where designers have control, where we can hold our word responsible. And this actually extends at several levels. Like, for example, community boards in New York City can vote on any ULURP or change in a land use process. They have the opportunity to review that and say whether that is something they want in the community or they don't. But I mean, consider this: how many people on the community board are actual professional planners? Or do they have the professional capacity to be able to comment on something that is as complex as zoning, or the density drawings that are being presented to them? Nor do they even have the funds to be able to hire professional help to do that. So I think, it goes back to the question, it goes back to the issue again, which is very key, that we have to do work on real empowerment and giving some real control. And granted, we will see a slowdown in projects. We probably, developers won't see profits coming as quick and as fast, but hey, I mean, as a community, we need to kind of wake up what's more important. And it also is a subtle shift in the values as a society, right?
Thank you.
What are we vouching for? What are we rooting for?
Thank you so much for highlighting that. In fact, there's a really interesting question in the Q&A that touches on that point for the three of you. What are some of the methods that you found to be useful in engaging the community in the design process, but also in the planning process and just in general? And also, do you feel that it's usually these types of services are contracted on one end, or is this something that community groups actually do in terms of organizing? What are some of your thoughts in response to that?
So I was just typing up some stuff on that question, and I can go first on this. I think that, these engagement processes, they can range from just simple statistical surveys to more involved design and planning workshops. It really depends on the nature of the project and what is the objective of the project, whether we are engaging in a policy discussion or we are engaging in more of a hands-on physical design discussion. So the tools that we'd want to use would obviously differ in both the cases. I think one thing that is key, I would say, is before any type of engagement, it's important to go into a community, any community or stakeholder group, and really lay out the present the lay of the land in terms of what's existing, what are the possibilities, and help people understand what would be the trade-offs. And I think once people understand that it becomes more effective engagement, that we can start to really gather feedback that would be more closely aligned with community desires. Because when people don't know what the trade-offs are in terms of what they're choosing and what they're not, then the expectations may also be very, very different. And the ideas and the solutions we come up with together might be very different. So I think that that's actually something that should be key, whether it is any, whether it is a statistical survey or statistical information that we're collecting, or it is even a, design and planning workshop. I think that it is our, we should take that as a responsibility to really educate the community about, what they're really getting into and what would be the consequences of each decision that they make.
Thank you, Shachi. As we begin to wrap up, then, Jalisa, from your point of view, what of these critical activities should come from outside, from external actors? How much of that should actually be led by the actual community? To what extent do you think that any type of organizing should be led by the communities on themselves? What is your take?
So what should be led by the community in terms of these projects? Is that what you're at?
Well, we were just hearing from Shachi highlighting all these important measures that professionals, designers should do, and all the different tactics, ethical best practices that are available. How much of the engagement, the community engagement and the organizing, do you think should be done by professionals coming from outside of the community, and how much of it do you actually think should be led by the communities themselves? What's the right balance there?
I mean, that's a difficult question, but I think, it should start from the communities, and should be led by the communities, but definitely we want the expertise of the designers and everyone. And I think Shachi made a great point about like laying out the lay of the land. I think transparency is just so important, and open communication is key to this as well. If we want to, again, that trust. But yeah, managing expectations, transparency, and open communication will be key for that. But making sure that, it comes from the community to begin with, and it ends with the community as well.
Thank you. Nick?
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, please, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Shachi.
I wanted to add to what Jalisa just said, and say that, starting from the community and ending from the community, that's actually a really great point, because we as professionals really provide the technical know-how, because sometimes we work in communities that we don't know all of the issues of, the political issues of. So before I would say engaging professional help, it's always a good idea for the communities to, broadly lay out what is the objective of what they are going to do, or define a loose goal. And once that loose goal is defined, then the professionals can come in and then start to help finesse how that can then become more nuanced, maybe more specific, and what does that really translate into. And obviously at the end, just because of the way the funding streams are, and also because of the way the institutional memories are actually, so that it is important that community leaders then take that and claim ownership of that, that it doesn't remain with professionals. So I think that point that Jalisa made about starting and ending with the community is a really important point in seeing effective outcomes.
Thank you, Shachi. Nick, any final words?
Just that I think there's probably also some attention that needs to be put on this question from the design education and kind of the design profession, and how it takes on projects, because traditionally designers are employed by private developers, and there's a kind of a traditional client relationship. Having the community as a client is much more rare, and really takes a certain kind of initiative and organization and capacity within the community. And it also assumes that there's only one community vision, and there might be conflicting community visions. And so really what this, I think, opens up is the question of how do designers engage politically with advocates and organizers in communities, and that probably needs to rest on some prior or long-term relationship. And so it's kind of an unsatisfying answer. But to Jalisa's point, the community vision probably can't emerge from a single community design charrette. And so it raises questions about what kind of structures are necessary to support those longer forms of engagement when there's not kind of a direct benefit or profit to be gained in the short term.
Thank you, Nick. And thanks so much to the three panelists. This has been great, super insightful presentations. These are difficult questions, things that we're all in it together. It's really about finding and working together on this. So really appreciate your insight about approaching them. With that, just really thank everybody. Thanks so much to the audience and the great questions that we had. Certainly we didn't address all of them, but we hope that we can explore a way to maybe reply or continue to be in touch via email and address some of them. With that, thanks again to everybody, and I pass it back to Franco so that we can close. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thanks to you, Juan, for facilitating such a great conversation. I apologize that my power went out at the very beginning, and now I'm sitting in my car using my phone to get on here. But thanks for filling in. Thanks to Shachi for organizing, and Jalisa and Nick for really insightful presentations. So I just want to invite you all to join us again next month, July 1st, the first Wednesday of every month. Our topic is sustained climate assessments. And any of you, just one final reminder, if you're interested in getting PDH credits for today's presentation, and or if you're interested in joining our 10-week class on incorporation of climate change into stormwater planning, please do be in touch. We'd love to have you as part of those efforts. So with that, thanks to everyone, especially Corinne for filling in where I dropped out. Thanks, Corinne. And we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everyone.